Welcome everyone to Mailfuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about 1899 episode 8. It is called The Key. It is the season finale and it's got a big ending. It's got a big ending that I actually really want to compare to Dark, but I'll maybe save that till the end just so that people who haven't seen Dark can leave because there's, there's spoilers for the end of that season. But yeah, I suppose I have to start with the ending and then go back and talk about other stuff because that's, I think, largely what everyone wants to hear discussed is the ending. The reveal of when this is actually taking place and where everyone is in reality whilst they're in this simulation. Obviously, I think most people, by the time you get to the end, are suspecting they're all hooked up to a machine of some kind. Kind of like the chairs in the Matrix where they're all kind of strapped in and their brains are connected to something or whatever. Maybe Evil Within's, if you played that video game, they're all in these weird bathtubs hooked into the simulation. Whatever it may be, that's kind of what you were probably expecting. Something of that kind. So, the finale overall, and I'm going to talk about the ending first, but just to sort of give my sort of feelings in the finale. I actually do like the ending. I think the ending's fun. I think it's a nice expansion that opens up a lot of possibilities for what season 2 could be if it's renewed. And Netflix are not that renew happy these days, so I won't hold my breath necessarily. But as a sci-fi fan, as a fan of this type of story, and the type of story that kind of becomes in the last 5 minutes of the finale, I'm on board. I'm on board for all of it, and there's some really nice details with it. I do think the finale as a whole does have some problems, though, and does kind of present a few issues potentially with some of the premise. I've heard people online complaining that the finale, particularly the last 5-10 minutes, kind of makes a lot of the season pointless, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that if you assume that the characters and what their pasts are irrelevant just because we find out that it is all in a simulation and because we're actually in the future, we're in 2099, that it's not relevant to who they are, I think that's a big mistake and a big assumption on people's parts that I don't think tracks. I think if the writing is worth anything, if it is half decent writing at all, following basic principles, then everything that those characters that we were introduced to were going through in their flashbacks and with their traumatic past will line up with what the real people have went through. The context will be different and maybe the details will be a little different, but much like how Mara is clearly, created and is living in this simulation to be with her presumably dead son, where there's some truth coming from that, I assume that some of the other characters, they did leave someone behind. I mean, the fact that, to get into the ending, right, the reveal that not only is it 2099, that they're on a spaceship, that they are literally on a ship, which mirrors what the simulation is, right? In the simulation, they're on a boat going across the Atlantic, and a lot of them are looking for a new home. It seems very much like in 2099, they're on this spaceship, and they're looking for a new home. It specifically says in the computer survival mission, so the stakes might even be higher, and that this is like the last of humanity looking for a habitable planet because Earth is screwed. Like, it could be that severe. It does say survival mission on the computer, which maybe indicates something like that. Maybe there's multiple ships like this. Maybe it's the only one. Who knows, right? There's so many questions. But I have to, there's so much that you can then take. Anytime they talk about wanting to get to a new home in the show, I think if you rewatch the season and you're thinking about it in the context of what is this really saying about who the real people are and then looking for a new home in the future, you get a bit of subtext, you get a bit of double meaning. There's a line from Henry early on when he's talking to Elliot that really stuck out to me when I watched this episode a second time for the review. Was he says to Henry when he's talking about all the passengers that he's watching on the TV screens, he says they came on this trip because they made the choice to forget their past. Now, admittedly, if it's a survival ship and it's like the last chance for humanity to find a new home and we're all dead otherwise, maybe that negates this a little bit. But let's say like, not, you know, there was some choice in the people who decided to go on this migration, right? In the future, in 2099, or whenever they left Earth, there was a choice of the people, you know, like a certain type of person, like, volunteered to go on this trip. And the reasons why they were escaping in the simulation probably parallels a lot of why these characters chose to leave in the future as well. It won't be the exact same because we're in a very different time period, but I do think it all still matters. I do think all of it is still relevant to who these characters are. And you know, we see them all in, they're effectively all in cryo sleep, right? And this simulation's playing out and they're hooked up to it whilst they're sleeping on this long space journey, which I think is a fun little reveal, just because it's like, there's some, like, I think we all expected them to be inside some sort of computer system or simulation from very early on. Like, there was signs of this, like, right from the, like, episode 1 or 2. Episode 2's ending with the TV screens, like, immediately it was like, well, where's these cameras? This has to probably be some kind of, like, computer world or something. So the idea, there's another layer to it, which is like, yeah, but there's more context. It's like, not just that they're in a simulation, this is something that's effectively keeping their minds busy whilst they're in cryo sleep because they're on a long journey in space. It's like, okay, all right, interesting. That's not to say that I think that that's the purpose of the simulation, is to just keep their minds busy. The way everyone talks about Mara in this episode, particularly her father, and about creating this place, it does kind of sound like she created this place to be with her dead son, and everyone else has been kind of roped in and trapped in it, regardless of their wishes. Like, no one, it doesn't sound like the rest of the characters consented to be in the simulation. Now, that could change, we could find out otherwise, but at least right now, that's the impression. Certainly, our father didn't consent to jack shit, by the sounds of it. He wants out. He's trapped in a simulation just like everyone else is. He's more aware of it. He's got his own little pocket of it that he's, like, controlling, and him and Sebastian are messing around. But it begs the question, who's this bald servant that comes in and delivers these messages? Is that another real person, or is that just like an NPC? Like, what? These are questions I have. The ending, though, I liked it. I mean, I thought it was like, the second we saw her face when she wakes up, I was like, oh, it's a spaceship. And I don't think that's like a huge, like, oh, I'm super smart. I think there's hints, but the light that's kind of like coming in every so often, it's like, okay, this is a spaceship. They're in a spinning ship. This is space. She looks out the window. We see that's called the Prometheus. Interesting. I mean, obviously the name Prometheus for a spaceship of this kind makes sense. It's not even, you know, there was a whole movie set in the Alien universe where they called the spaceship the Prometheus. But it's interesting that in the context of the simulation, the Prometheus was the ship that's already failed, and they're on the Kerberos. I think that's kind of interesting. Maybe you could read into that a little bit. But then the computer comes up, because this is the thing. Right at the start of the show, we talked a lot about our brother, right? We talked a lot about Mara's brother, and, you know, Kieran, which we might have heard his name back then, but I certainly didn't learn it until this episode because it was said a bunch of times. But there's a line early on from the father where, when Mara brings up Kieran, he says something to the effect, I'll get the exact line, I did write it down. Yeah. Believe me, he's the last one you should be concerned about, is the line that Henry has about Kieran when she asks, where's my brother? And he talks about how Kieran's an avoider and Mara's a seeker, and that means she prods at things, it means she goes looking for answers, it means she does extravagant things to deal with her pain in terms of having a simulation. But then the more juicier stuff is when her and Daniel are talking right before she wakes up. And we basically get the setup that Kieran might be the villain, the real villain, or the villain for season 2 at the very least, where the father's trapped in here like everyone else is. Kieran, though, in the real world has taken over the simulation, and Daniel says he has to be stopped or everything will be lost. And this is much bigger than you think it is. And that line, it's much bigger than you think it is, you know, makes me think, oh, this is like humanity's last chance to survive, of finding a new home and surviving, or something like that. But obviously the ending with Kieran on the computer talking to her, it did kind of feel like, is Kieran a real person or just their AI? That was the first thing I got. I was getting some HAL 9000 vibes or something, where I'm not sure if Kieran is literally her brother and is a person, or if this is more like the ship's computer system that is taking control, and that's why everyone, including Mara, is trapped in the simulation. Because Daniel says that he's been trying to wake her up for a while, and it's not just about like her doing this to all of them. Yeah, maybe she started the simulation for her own selfish emotional reasons, but the computer system's going haywire and doing all this stuff. That would be another very science fiction concept to bring into it. But I couldn't help but feel that, because it's not like she hears Kieran's voice over a speaker or something like that. It's like, this old school text on a computer saying hello, sister. And if you're thinking why the sister brother terminology, well, to go back to Alien, they refer to their computer in that movie as mother. And I wonder if that's an intentional, almost kind of reference and like hint of what Kieran actually is. I was definitely getting that vibe from that last scene. Now, if Kieran exists and he's just in like the captain's like room somewhere else in the ship, and he's just like sending a message to her through the computer, that's obviously very plausible. But something about this just felt like Kieran's the computer system to me. So I could be completely wrong, but that's what I was getting from it. But I liked the last 5 minutes. I thought it looked cool. I thought the ship looked cool. It was really exciting to see this new context in place, and I love the idea of everything in their simulation as being these hints as to who the real people really are, and that thematically everything does kind of line up with the real people. I think is exciting. To me, that's part of a fun puzzle that makes some sense. The parts of the finale that I'm not as into, or the parts that I don't think work quite as well, is kind of the. It's kind of the almost like we can do anything we want as if it was magic, just because we can have not Kieran, sorry, I've been talking about the brother too much. Just because Daniel straight up says, "Oh, I changed the code, and now the pyramid that Henry has is useless, and I have one here that's the real one. I also changed it so this would happen here, and blah blah blah." Like the way he just says, "I just changed the code," it kind of felt like all we saw of him was he was hitting these buttons and sliding these little sliders at one of the terminals inside all the wiring in the walls for like a lot of the episode, and that just does a lot of things, and it's nothing that we as an audience have any concrete feeling of like what he's actually trying to do. When it comes to this sort of stuff, you kind of have to have some sense of rules that the audience can understand, and obviously early on some things might feel like anything can happen, but as it goes on, in any good mystery, certainly, you start to understand and it falls into place. Okay, this happens because of this, and this allows for this. Having him just say, "I just changed the code," and that magically solving some things that the plot needs to be solved feels a little, I don't know, a little cheap, I guess. Like, when he says that, I just kind of feel like, oh, I guess you can just do that. There's nothing interesting or engaging about him just, pressing the buttons with us not knowing what he's going to do or even trying to do, with seemingly no obstacles other than just it looks hard because he's sweating and he's like, "Oh god, work, damn it, work." That means nothing to us, really. So that's kind of a downside to that, and it certainly. What was the other thing that kind of bugged me about? Oh yeah, so the captain. That's kind of bugs me. So as much as I think all the people and their memories are important and they're still very relevant to who the real people are, I will say that from a plot progression point of view, there is a little bit of a problem with how meaningless so I thought it was really interesting and important that Daniel had moved the captain to the archive. And then in the last episode, when the other characters went into the archive, that also felt important, and it felt exciting that they were being reunited with the captain who was already there. And then the captain comes aboard the ship at the start of this episode, and it's like, okay, everyone's together. The captain does nothing in this episode. The captain just hangs around with Mara and then gets turned off by Sebastian, right? Seemingly dead, at least in this cycle of the simulation. Obviously, he'll be fine. He'll be in the next one. All dandy, like nothing happened. But it kind of felt like it felt important that he got separated into this like special different place in the simulation, and then that he was reunited with everyone, or maybe now they can like form some kind of plan. And I think the captain, and to an extent the rest of the characters on the ship, felt like they didn't really have much to do this episode. The other characters just kind of run around the ship as the the infection of the stuff is like growing all over the hallways. There's a lot of this just them running in halls and not really caring about what Mara's up to. They decide early on they don't really believe her story about it being a simulation, and they're just kind of running around. Yeah, they all have the letters and stuff, whatever, but it's just them running around. There is like one interesting element when they end up in like different people's memories when Daniel's like messing with the system, but for the most part it's just them running around. And the captain, by extension, maybe even like a worse example, is he's just with Mara asking questions that don't really get any answers because she doesn't really have any more answers. And at this point, him asking what's really going on feels a little bit like, okay, we've been asking what's going on for a while now. As an audience, I'm moving past just this vague what's going on question, right? Where we've got some details now. We've got some concrete ideas. And then it just gets turned off. So ultimately, it kind of felt like the captain didn't really serve much purpose this episode, and the way they held him back last episode and then brought him back in at the end felt like a big deal. It felt important, and then it doesn't feel that important now in hindsight. So it kind of retroactively made a couple of things there feel a little bit less important. So that's kind of a shame. And I would describe that as a bit of a negative on the finale. And like I say, the other characters just kind of running around just kind of felt almost like time killing, like just like, oh, we need some action happening, so they're running around from the infection as if it's a chase scene. Obviously the one thing that is interesting is when they end up in the various memories, and I noted down who went to who, because it was like different pairs go to different things. So Jerome and Clemens end up in Ying Li's past, on the boat, on the little boat, and like the infection stuff just comes out of the box they look in. Tove and Virginia end up in the war past, Lucian and Jerome's past, and at least to begin with, then Ying Li runs into like through another portal and ends up in Oleg's past, which that was the exciting part, is that, okay, this is actually someone she cares about, she's in his past, she recognizes the postcard, so there's some context for her. And then Oleg, and this is probably the most interesting part of the whole thing, is that Oleg, covered in black oil, as opposed to other colors of oil, but you know what I mean, he comes out of the thing, I don't even know what it is, but he comes out of a thing, and covered in black oil, and he just like walks over, and it reminded me of Under the Skin. I was getting like Under the Skin vibes from this, but he's just so like silent and just walks like an alien over to like the horizon screen and just pulls off a panel and goes inside the wall, and that's all we see of him. It's very creepy, and it made me think, like, is he still going to be around doing stuff like this weird version of Oleg next season? I don't think so, because when the simulation ends, it seems like the entire archive gets purged. Like, all the characters all fade away, as does the ship. It looks like, while the archive seemed to exist from, cycle to cycle before, it seems like the archive's all been erased now. Because you see them all disintegrating, all the ships, you see the people disintegrating as they're looking up at all the light and stuff. But yeah, so it probably isn't around, but it kind of almost felt like, oh, this was too weird, creepy, and cool to not have him like be this like weird presence going forward, like until somehow they reset him or something. Like, we have this weird evil looking version of Oleg just kind of running around, not even running, actually, that's the point. He's walking just very steady. He's got a sort of Michael Myers-esque pace to him. That's very interesting. I thought it was a cool visual at the very least. I don't have too much to read into with it, largely, but yeah. So yeah, and and I think obviously Mara's stuff is super interesting once she ends up with her father, and once and obviously the scene with Daniel and all the stuff that comes up about what's really going on. But yeah, like the first half of her stuff with the captain, it's just kind of them, like, how did they get back to the asylum when the door was closed? It almost made me wonder why her shaft in her room was closed off at all from a script perspective, because it turns out it's only hers that's been covered up and Daniel's is still open, so they just go through his and then go through the connections, just like Daniel did last episode, to get to like her memory. And a lot of that was just her figuring out things that we, the audience, have already seen someone else do. So it wasn't that exciting on its own. It didn't spend too much time on it. So I'm not saying it was like a negative per se, but it did just kind of feel like busy work until the real stuff in the episode could get going. I mean, ultimately, this episode, like the last like 20 minutes, is full of stuff that's important. And before that, I would say the stuff with Henry and Elliot, where Henry's trying to like show Elliot that he's been kept alive in here. And that's a neat point as well when he gives him the little flashback where he like sees Mara injecting him to make him forget and reset or whatever. Like Mara and Daniel are wearing the black jumpsuits that all of the passengers of the spaceship are wearing at the end. So Mara at the end of the episode is wearing this black jumpsuit. So it does seem like this was like a version of the simulation. Whenever this happened, this scene where she injects Elliot to make him forget, this seems to be when she still had control of it. And this was like right back at the, maybe in one of the early cycles, when things hadn't gone bad yet, when Kieran hadn't taken control, whether he's the AI of the ship or an actual person who's her brother. But, so no, that detail is really interesting. That detail, so, I like a lot of the ending of the episode, and I like a lot of the stuff that it sets up. But the actual, like, running around for a lot of the episode does just kind of feel like running around. Both from the people running around on the ship, on the Kerberos, and Mara and the captain running around just like talking about, vaguely, oh, this is all a simulation, it's all fake, it's not really here, how do we find my father, these doors should be here, kind of thing. That stuff just kind of felt like we're just kind of repeating beats, and it's like, I think we, the audience, have already moved on a little bit from that, because, we have more information now. And you have to sort of say how they get from A to B, don't get me wrong, which is why I'm saying, why couldn't her shaft still just be there so that we could just see them go into the shaft and then we could come back to them straight out, just, we could skip it all the part where they go through Daniel's memory and just go straight to them being in the asylum and Sebastian shows up. You could skip out some of their stuff to tighten the episode up. Sure, is it interesting that the captain gets to see like the photos of the family and stuff? Maybe a little bit, but I mean, it's nothing super essential, it feels like. But hey, so no, so super interesting though. I do like the ending. I do like the 2099 ending. I think it's a cool reveal. I think it both completely shakes things up, presents a larger show with a larger conflict, which does seem quite exciting. But I do think the past of all the characters is still very relevant to who they are. I think they all mean something in the context of of who they really are. There's conversations in this episode about Plato's cave allegory and the idea that what if the reality we're in, or the reality outside the one you're living in, is reality. If that's God's existence, then are we just his dollhouse? And then if that's the case, then who created God? And I think if I'm going with the Kieran's actually a computer system, he's an AI, then I would say that she created the AI, and then that AI is not the creator of the simulation, but is now in control of the simulation. But she's the creator of the AI, so like there's a kind of like a Russian doll effect of like who created what and who's in control of what and which one is the reality. So that's very cool. I will say, if they do like a double thing where even the spaceship's a simulation inside of something, that would be, I think, disappointing and completely uninspired. I don't think they're going to do that. I'm mentioning it just because, just in case they go that route. As it is, though, I do think the ending's a lot of fun, and I hope it gets a season 2, so they can explore this arguably more exciting like new story than the one we've even been getting, which is the idea that this is a fight with a person or an AI to save all the people and get this ship going in the right direction wherever it's supposed to go. And the weird thing is that even though the bulk of the show has been this simulation, it's been them in a fake world. This idea that the characters have felt like there's a creator, a god that's influencing what's happening is kind of true. Like this Kieran is influencing things that are happening. So yeah, there's a lot to do with this still. There's a lot of good stuff. It's funny because I do think the ending is really good, and I think it's one of my favorite moments of the whole season, and makes me excited for what the future of it is. But I do think the episode as a whole it suffers from some problems of just kind of like running around without much purpose or anything meaningful coming from it. So positives and negatives, but ultimately positive because I like the ending and I want season 2, and that's ultimately like, what more do you want from a season finale than to want to get the next season? So I suppose in that sense, the season as a whole I think is enjoyable. I think it's not as good as Dark, at least not yet. I am excited about where it's going and how that can open things up. I think Dark did have its structural problems at times, especially as by the time you get to season 3, and it feels like, okay, we've kind of established all this time travel stuff by this point. But I do think that because there was more of a solid logic to the time travel, and like you could kind of like understand the different time periods and how they connected as you were getting more parts of the puzzle as it was playing out, I think that was more satisfying and something that you could understand and theorize on, compared to, Daniel just saying, oh, I reprogrammed everything. I changed the code, so things are magically different now. We can't predict what he's doing with that because ultimately it can just be anything. So I think that's kind of a fundamental difference. I will say, I'm going to spoil the end of season 1 of Dark here just for a second because I want to compare the two. So if you've not seen Dark, thank you for watching. But so yeah, the end of season 1 of Dark kind of has the same ending in a weird way, in a very broad sense, where it's like going to the future for the first time, right? I kind of laughed when I realized, oh, it's the future. Oh, Dark ended that way too. The last scene was in the future. Obviously the context is very different, and this is not time travel per se, although I do think it's very funny that this show, well, it's not a time travel show again. Instead of like jumping from time to time, we're a simulation in the past and then we're actually in the future in the real world. It's kind of funny how it's kind of mirroring what Dark was to it. It's almost like they're evolving their own kind of narrative a little bit. So I do think it's a really intriguing show, and I started to care more about some of the characters by the end, and I do love what it set up for season 2. I'm very curious if I watch season 1 again, if there's going to be little lines and things that I stick out. Because even just watching this episode again, because I watched the episode twice, when I watched it a second time, there was that line early on from Henry that made me go, oh, it sounds like he could easily just be talking about, he is, because he knows what reality is, at least to some extent. Like, it sounds like he's just talking about the decisions the real people made to get on the spaceship, as opposed to the ship in the simulation. And I'm wondering if there's other little lines, or whether they're intentional because the character knows what they're talking about, or because they're just thematically kind of poignant. But I'm wondering if on a rewatch you sort of notice a few things, like, okay, if this is we're on a spaceship and there's potentially an AI, if not a madman, controlling everything now, then like, do you read any of these moments or things a little bit differently because of that? So. And then obviously it's important to know as well that not only did Maura create this place, at least for a time she was in control, and it was intentionally doing this to, spend more time with her son. And the opening scene kind of hints at this, where, the Elliot grabs the bug and is like, oh, can I keep it? And she's like, no, you can't trap it in the box because then it would be a prisoner. And you can't keep things forever. You have to eventually let them go. And, obviously that's like tying in that she's keeping her, at least a version of her son, alive in here, and he can never leave, along with everyone else seemingly. So no, it's interesting. But yeah, that is my thoughts on the 1899 finale. So let me know what you thought of this episode and the season as a whole, of course, in the comments below. Like, subscribe, ding the bell for notifications, all that stuff. It helps me out a lot if you do. And of course, you can go over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV if you want to support all the content and keep it all coming. But thank you very much for joining me. It's been fun going through this season and giving some thoughts and theories. So yeah, in the coming days I'll probably be back to finishing off Cabinet of Curiosities, and I think I need to go back and do the first episode of Wednesday, because that was a pilot vote winner and I just ignored it because I wanted to keep doing 1899. So and then whatever else is going to be, I just started the classic Quantum Leap with Tara, so if that sounds of interest, go check out that. Check out Mail Fuzz Movies for all the movie podcasts. There's a science fiction movie podcast, a horror movie podcast, and then a new podcast called The Collector's Cut, which is myself and David working through franchises or seasons of movies and things like that. So go and have a look. But that is me. Thank you very much once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?